Good morning, Nigeria, and a beautiful new week to you all. Let's take a look at today's stories dominating today's newspaper headlines. Firstly, we'll start from the New Telegraph. On the New Telegraph newspaper on page 4, which is boldly written, Federal government to raise another 729 billion naira bond to clear June cost legacy debts. At the top of the newspaper on page 25, petrol price hits 1,239 naira per litre on product sale in dollars. To read more on that, you go to page 25 of the New Telegraph paper. And on page 911 of the newspaper, which is written, 2027 presidency, Tinubu, Obi, Atiku led as candidates scrabble for Southeast votes. To read more on that, you go to page 9 and 11. And on page 2, Sirab demands NAS withdrawal of social media shutdown bill. To read more on that, you go to page 2 of the newspaper. And on page 2 and 28 of the newspaper, which is written, students killed, 46 rescued as troops foil ISWAP adoption attempt in Borno State. To read more on that, you go to page 2 and 28 of the New Telegraph paper. Away from that newspaper to the Nigerian Tribune. The Nigerian Tribune newspaper on page 2, which is boldly written, Tinubu will beat Atiku, Southern Coalition, APC boast. The APC candidate are boasting that Tinubu will beat Atiku and Southern Coalition. To read more on that, you go to page 2 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper. And on page 5 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper at the top, Nigerian Revenue Service sets July 31 deadline for taxpayers to adopt e-invoicing system. And on page 25 of the newspaper, still at the top, Onyekasola Badejo Okosanye emerged NBA president, becomes second female president. So Onyekasola Badejo emerges as the Nigerian Bar Association president, and she has become the second female president. To read more on that, you go to page 25 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, on page 26, troops foil attempted mass adoptions in Borno, rescues 46 students. To read more on that, you go to page 26 of the newspaper. And on page 5 of the newspaper at the bottom, fresh concerns over increasing political activities, inflation as economy hits H2. To read more on that, you go to page 5 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Sun, and on the Daily Sun newspaper on page 6, which is boldly written, reasons we are prioritizing state police, says senators. Senators are saying that reason why they are prioritizing state police. To read more on that, you go to page 6 of the newspaper. At the top of the newspaper on page 8, governments have crippled local governments, says ex-council chairman. This is coming from the ex-council chairman that government has crippled over local government. To read more on that, you go to page 8 of the Daily Sun newspaper. And at the bottom of the newspaper on page 25, e-invoicing, NRS issues deadline for compliance. To read more on that, you go to page 25 of the Daily Sun newspaper. And on page 26 of the Daily Sun newspaper, which is written, LASU Prof. Ikani delivers NGE organized 4th Jakande lecture on Thursday in Lagos. To read more on that, you go to page 26 of the newspaper, and on page 4 and 5 of the newspaper at the bottom, troops foil ISWAP adoption attempts in Borno school amid rescue of 46 students. To read more on that, you go to page 4 and 5, where troops were able to dismantle the ISWAP adoption attempt in Borno school, and they rescued 46 students. Away from that newspaper to the Matrix newspaper, on the Matrix newspaper on page 2, which is boldly written, Tinubu urges ECOWAS to condemn xenophobic attacks in South Africa. This is coming from President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, as he urges ECOWAS to condemn xenophobic attacks in South Africa. At the top of the newspaper, which is written on page 5, CPPE, poor implementation could undermine federal government social intervention program. Poor implementation could undermine federal government social intervention program. To read more on that, to go to page 3 of the newspaper. And still on page 3 of the newspaper, NBA election sparks outrage. NBA election sparked outrage. Read more on that, you go to page 3 of the Matrix newspaper. And still in the same newspaper, on page 2, tax ahead of Bonham as he assumes office as UK's PM today. To read more on that, you go to page 2 of the newspaper. And on page 23 of the newspaper, Senegal's Faye elected new ECOWAS chairman. Senegal's Faye elected new ECOWAS chairman. To read more on that, you go to page 23 of the newspaper. Still on page 23 of the newspaper on entertainment, I am more mature than my online character, says Pella. This is coming from Pella, a TikTok streamer. He said that he's more mature than his online character. To read more on that, you go to page 23 of the newspaper. And on sports, on page 25, Spain seals second World Cup trophy, beats Argentina. Congratulations to Spain for winning the World Cup trophy, and they're able to beat Argentina. To read more on that, you go to page 25 of the Matrix newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Guardian newspaper. On the Guardian newspaper on page 6, which is boldly written, DMO, Dangote mobilized 11 trillion naira in 6 months as real sector struggles. At the top of the newspaper, on page 3, cooking gas import surged by 1,400% as petrol supply dips by 22%. To read more on that, you go to page 3 of the newspaper. And still in the same newspaper on page 4, ICPC secures forfeiture of 941.9 million naira from IPPIS ghost workers. To read more on that, you go to page 4 of the newspaper. Still on page 4 of the newspaper, Sirap urges NAS to withdraw social media shutdown bill. Sirap are urging NAS to withdraw social media shutdown bill. To read more on that, you go to page 4 of the newspaper. And at the bottom of the newspaper on page 6, parties begin candidate upload, express confidence ahead of INEC deadline. To read more on that, you go to page 6 of the Guardian newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Vanguard newspaper. On the Vanguard newspaper on page 32, which is boldly written on FIFA 2026 World Cup, superb Spain ruled the world, overwhelm Argentina. Congratulations to Spain for winning the 2026 World Cup yesterday against Argentina. At the top of the newspaper on page 9, troops Mopo foil mass adoption attempts at Federal Government Girls College in Borno State. And on page 14 of the newspaper, Nigeria's macroeconomic reforms are bearing durable fruits, coming from Agama, Secretary Director General. To read more on that, you go to page 14 of the newspaper. And at the bottom of the newspaper, on page 26, NGA holds 4th Lateef Jakande Memorial Lecture on Credible Elections, July 23. To read more on that, you go to page 26 of the newspaper. And on page 9 of the newspaper, Badejo Okosaye wins NBA presidential poll, pledges accountability. Congratulations to her for winning the NBA presidential poll. Away from that newspaper to the Punch newspaper. And on the Punch newspaper on page 7, which is boldly written, dollar sale roll, marketers halt Dangote fuel loading, federal government steps in. At the top of the newspaper on page 21, business experts, CBN to hold rates as MPC meets today. To read more on that, you go to page 21 of the Punch newspaper. And still on page 21 of the Punch newspaper, which is written, state pockets 2.37 trillion naira VAT under new tax regime. To read more on that, you go to page 21 of the newspaper. And at the bottom of the newspaper, and on page 8, Ogun 2027, Yayi Iyabo Obasanjo clash over campaign refund. To read more on that, you go to page 8 of the newspaper. And on page 27 of the newspaper, federal government raises 729 billion naira bond to clear Genco's legacy debt. To read more on that, go to page 27 of the newspaper. And on page 4 and 5 of the newspaper at the bottom, tenant dies after disputed eviction at Lagos State. To read more on that, you go to page 4 and 5 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the last newspaper for today, the Daily Trust. On the Daily Trust, which is written, surviving on a soldier's 100,000 salary. At the top of the newspaper, Phantom Council, last moment of alleged middleman to Gbajabiamila. To read more on that, you go to page 8 of the newspaper. And on page 10 of the newspaper, Niger APC primary crisis pits Bago against ex-Governor Benlo. To read more on that, you go to page 10 of the newspaper. Still at the top of the newspaper, 3 students killed as troops foil mass adoption in Borno. To read more on that, you go to page 7 of the newspaper. And at the bottom of the newspaper, on page 31, congratulations to Spain as they beat Argentina to win second World Cup. To read more on that, you go to page 31 of the newspaper. Lastly, at the bottom of the newspaper, one agency, two heads. Tinubu's directive doesn't stand, says Wike's ally. This is coming from Wike's ally. Says one agency, two heads. Tinubu directive doesn't stand. What does it mean by that? To read more on that, you go to page 5 and 6 of the Daily Trust newspaper. And that's all for today's newspaper review. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more updates. I'm Chidera Esom. Do have a beautiful week.